every success. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Palatini, for your words. We note the important role and the systemic approach that must be developed by wholesale markets that are providing and ensuring not just accessibility to healthy diets, but also education about seasonal products and the diversity of products that we have. I'm calling now Mr. Stéphane Layani, Chairman of the World Union of Wholesale Markets, to introduce his speech.
I see it. Okay, thank you very much. Before all, I want to thank again Mr. Q Dong-Yu, my friend, the Director General of UNFSS, and Mr. Palatini. I agree most of the things Martin Frick, I speak very well. I agree with most of the things that we have been said. It is time now to reflect and imagine together how we provide healthy diet for the planet with a long-term scope. If food security and food system sustainability was already a major topic on political agenda, the COVID pandemic leaves no doubt about the must to collectively act to transform our food system. While the world's population is rapidly increasing and land degradation is exacerbated by climate change, it is clear that ensuring food security will be among one of the key challenges of the 21st century. In 2050, the world's population is projected to increase to 9.8 billion from 7.6 billion. Among 70% of population is expected to live in cities. 2/3 of the global population. Simultaneously, 70% of all agricultural land globally is experiencing extreme degradation, and climate change risks accelerate this trend. These challenges will again exist alongside rising food price and a growing demand for increased supply and diversification of food. All these facts shows us how urgent it is to gather the major stakeholders together to enhance pathway to ensure equitable and sustainable food future. We are lucky enough to have this year a unique opportunity to engage in real commitments toward this transformation now, as in the context of the forthcoming United Nations Food System Summit. Every nation of the world is going to speaking and thinking of fully taking clear engagements and to develop sustainable and resilient food systems, as Martin Fricks and Mr. Donkyu said precedently. It is the second time. The last one was 20 years ago that the UN is organizing a food summit. At the format of the UN summit, we have today an exceptional opportunity to envision together concrete action that can address the challenges and the pathway to succeed in developing sustainable food systems. Today it is time for all of us to take action and engage to make our food system sustainable and resilient. For sure, transforming tomorrow's food system is a complex task. But I believe that the COVID-19 crisis is also an opportunity to adapt our approaches. Let me explain my point. We have seen that the COVID-19 pandemic has upset the food system like never before, showing also in a clear way the disparities of food system resilience around the world. Starting from March last year, we have witnessed disruption of food system chains, from logistical issues, from a shortage of workforces, radical change in demand. Each country shared challenging moments, but some countries experienced less disruption, price volatilities, and food shortages than others. The role of wholesale markets was, in this sense, reflected in several dimensions of the effective functioning of the food supply chain. During the first wave of lockdown, wholesale market showed their essential role to sustain the agri-food sustain share. While other agri-food chains broke apart, the multiplicity of factors working with wholesale markets help us to ensure resilience and find quickly solutions when one of the supply channels was not working. It is a fact that in countries that count upon modern wholesale markets, accessibility and availability to healthier diets is better ensured. After the crisis, national and local government from all over the world recognize the pivotal role that wholesale market play to guarantee greener, more resilient and sustainable food, environmental capacity to ensure daily accessibility and healthy diet. Our infrastructure play a crucial role to structure upstream and downstream and fresh food actors acting as virtuous catalyzer for the sector. Wholesale market facilitates shortened food supply chains, given access to market for the farmers, and particularly small and medium-sized ones that are the ones that contribute in 70% of the food produced globally, while only using 30% of global resources. Promote a larger diversity of fresh food concentrated in one place. Some markets come with more than 10,000 fresh food produce references, 1 million in my market. Facilitate better articulation between major actors, farmers, logisticians, street markets. They ensure right amounts of volumes, what we can daily food availability for growing cities, and make it easier to ensure traceability. By putting together most of the fresh food producers offer in one place, they foster better, smarter logistics and the potential of helping drastically manage to reduce food waste and enhance circular economy in our sector. Despite all this important function that they play, I must say that wholesale market rules were for a long time disregarded. What was probably because they have this middle role that often makes them invisible. And now, would you imagine a world with airplanes but without airport? It is the same for fresh food. It is a world with wholesale market and products. Accurate fresh food supply requires adequate infrastructure. Mr. Donkou said this, and now linked with improvement in urban food policy planning. Unfortunately, food is more complex than airplanes. Our food is composed by a mosaic of food systems with culture expressing their own identities, diversified production, shopping, and eating patterns rather than standardized food system. Of course, food systems are complex and cultural related networks. We must find pathways to feed our global population with balance and healthy and nutritious in accordance, Mr. Lucebillo, in accordance with a cultural and local reality. Standardized approaches have revealed their limits and colossal costs on our health and on our ecosystem, environment, health, and societies in the past. Yet, our experience guaranteeing supply for fresh, healthy diet worldwide shows us that we can also propose some common pillars to ensure effective ways of ensuring sustainable food system. This means, of course, also to enhance investments in structuration of the food sector at national and local level, and making food security, very important, a major sovereign mission of every state through articulated food governance policy. Multi-stakeholders dialogue must be fostered between local, regional, and global scale in order to achieve a sustainable food system that combines economic, social, and environmental sustainability. But also, to succeed in creating sustainable, resilient food system, it is a must to adopt a systemic and coordinated approach. I am convinced that the only way of doing this is by engaging all the stakeholders along the chain. In this sense, again, as they gather a myriad of all the stakeholders, and because of their responsibility to supply fresh food to cities across the world, wholesale market can contribute in this shift of paradigm and can be the forefront of this new way of doing food policy. Wholesale market mission is to ensure an easier accessibility of the market for producers, an effective distribution of affordable, fresh, healthy, nutritious, sustainable food for all in compliance with the Agenda 2020. Who had an opportunity to organize 4 insightful, independent, regional, national dialogues in the frame of the United Nations food system, respectively with Asia Pacific, Latin America, Europe, and Africa to further understand challenges, opportunities, and game-changing solutions to achieve healthier food system to regional realities. As an outcome of this dialogue, well, almost 250 experts participated. We identified 3-4 challenges that countries around the world are facing: accessibility, affordability, and sustainability. First, accessibility. Inequality of access to nutritious and healthy and sufficient food remains a reality of many livelihoods. Severe and moderate level of food insecurity concern about 26% of the global population, mostly living in Asia and in Africa, Mr. African Chairman Eva Maron. This lack of access to regular, healthy food in terms of quantity and quality puts people's health and nutrition well-being at risks. This situation has been deepened by the COVID-19 pandemic globally, make it accessible, to have access to healthy food, and make it easier for people to choose healthy food looks like one of our major challenges. How can we do this? By improving food environment. For that, we need a robust system that can ensure fresh food availability in a daily basis. Today, 19% of street markets are being supplied by wholesale markets. 3 billion consumers per day that buy fresh products that come from our infrastructure. Second, affordability. Healthy diets are unaffordable to many people around the world. The most conservative estimate shows that they are unaffordable for more than 3 billion people in the world. This is crucial to foster alternatives to ensure affordable, healthy diets to all segments of the population in a sustainable food system by 2030. To achieve so, short supply chains as well street markets, Mr. Retail Market President Jean-Paul, needs to be promoted, which will ensure high-quality, nutritious food for affordable prices, and WUWM promote each day Love Your Local Market campaign, which is very important to make in mind that local markets are the basis of good food. Wholesale market can have a significant impact on this issue by shortening the food supply chain, but also by creating a conducive environment with raising awareness activities or support diet-related health programs and education food redistribution for lower-income households. For instance, I say again, WUWM and Jean-Paul created Love Your Local Market campaign. This global initiative celebrates wholesale and retail market with 4,000 participants in 19 countries. It is a unique opportunity not only to connect livelihood to their markets, but also to reconnect them to food, flavors, and seasonality, and to help change people eating pattern. Last but not the least, sustainability. Achieving sustainability food system by 2030 requires significant action. Agriculture and food-related activities are accounting for at least one-third total greenhouse gas emission, 25%. One-third seems to me very exaggerated. In addition to that, standardized agricultural practice, and responsible of the degradation of biodiversity and affecting the availability of food. Over the last 100 years, more than 90% of crops varieties have disappeared. Scarcity is an issue that we must also address, in particular in a context growing demography. I can present you an example. It can take up 50 liters of water to produce an orange. Loss in fruits and vegetables represent a waste in increasingly scarce resources such as soil and water. With the climate change crisis affecting our livelihood and opportunities to future generations, we must revisit our system in a way to be a low-carbon intensive. Wholesale market can drive this transition by finding a better optimization of food and distribution. How? Through a better logistical chain, the implementation of transparent traceability, better integration of the cold chain along the value chain, better fight against food waste, better communication, and better coordination between supply and demand, thanks to the data and innovation, and ensuring, very important, rich food in environment for cities. We are actively decongestioning our logistics to reduce environmental impact. In addition to that, we participate in the promotion of investment on green energy, low carbon infrastructure, storage facilities, effort in the reduction of food waste, effort in reduction of losses in both domestic side but also in the value chain, and promoting, very important, circular economy by upcycling and recycling unsold produce. For all of this, I believe, Mr. President of Milan, I believe that modern wholesale market can be a game changer to ensure healthy diet, Mr. Palatini, around the world. That's why I think that it is crucial, Mrs. Putnik, it is crucial for us to have platforms like World Union of Wholesale Market to foster insight, good practices, and debates to pursue together to the transition of a healthier, sustainable food system. Just a few words in French. Je pense que le WUWM.
I believe that our union is able to gather all the actors of the food chain from production to consumption in order to think together about new rules of the game so that citizens can have better food, healthier food, while respecting the value of our farmers. We're not trying to change all the rules of the game, but we want to have our consumers and producers happy. And the wholesale market is the middleman, so to say, the link between the producer and the consumer, so that all the actors of the food chain are respected. So with new rules of the game, our union will play a pivotal role. I'm addressing the African president, the president of the Asian group, the Latin American and American group. With all these presidents, we're going to change the rules of the game. So we will put power in the hands of consumers. They will present their demands and their requests to the wholesale markets.
The rules to healthier, affordable, accessible world with fresh food of quality, with price for agricultural projects and less waste, less utilization of natural resource. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for all the participants in the high-level plenary. We're actually a little bit late of time, so I'm going to introduce the next session, and we're not going to have a break because we have a lot of people following us online right now. Okay, so I'm glad to introduce you for the second plenary high-level session about the future of food in the post-COVID world and how can we envision a better future together. Carolyn Steel. Carolyn?
Hello.
Hello.
Very good to be with you.
Glad to have you here.
Yeah, I'm just going to repeat everything Stéphane just said with pictures, basically, because my message is very similar. And here it is, and I hope you can see it properly. But we live in very perilous times, and I think we're all aware of this. You know, on top of the ecological challenges that we face, we have, for the last over a year now, had COVID. And I think it's an extraordinary, COVID has shone a light in many ways on issues that already existed, that we're basically all in this together. There are no real borders in the world. And I think that's something that anyone who runs a wholesale market is probably already extremely well aware of. I'm going to talk about my concept of Sitopia. And the reason I'm going to do that is because I really believe that food is by far the most powerful tool and lens that we have for dealing with these extraordinary global challenges that we now face. Sitopia just means food place, for the Greek word sitos for food and topos for place, and it's a word that I invented about 15 years ago now, actually as a food-based alternative to utopia. So food connects everything in our world, and if we don't value food, then we live in a bad Sitopia, and if we do value food, we live in a good one. And I'm actually going to show you this drawing that I did, which really explains the structure of Sitopia. So I think, you know, for most people, their sort of primary experience of food is obviously the fact that they eat. And so, you know, if you like, the plate of food represents their portal into the world of food. When we eat, we share, we communicate. That could be, you know, siblings in a family, but, you know, food is the great connector in our lives. But somebody has always cooked for us. So there's an aspect of love and care and nurturing in the process of receiving that food. And hopefully there's some sort of gratitude going back in the other direction. And I think, for all of us as humans, as Stéphane referred to this briefly, we have this sense of what our food is, the food of home, the food of the place where we belong. So food is always extremely cultural, and it's always extremely powerfully connected to our sense of identity. And so then where did that food come from? Well, this is where you all come in. It came from some kind of market. Now, I know it's much more complicated than this, but basically there is a mechanism of exchange, which is normally situated in the city, where the person who cooked the food will have somehow had a transaction in this space. And this is really the basis of the economy. And I believe it is the thing that drives the economy more powerfully than anything else, because so many things are affected by food that we don't necessarily always think of directly as food. So there's money, exchange, here there's trust, there's knowledge, there's competition within the market itself. And that really is the lifeblood of basically what we call civilization. And it sits in the city, because cities evolved as places of exchange. But of course, the city sits in the countryside that feeds it. So if you can see what this drawing does, it kind of radiates out from a plate of food wider and wider into the wider world. Most people in the world now live in cities, as we know. They need nutrition that comes from elsewhere, ultimately from nature. So the stuff of life is coming into this kind of engine of exchange. And at the same time, waste is going out. And the question of how we deal with that kind of cycle is, of course, now increasingly we're aware of its importance again, after maybe 200 years of slightly forgetting its importance, which I'll come on to. And of course, beyond all of that is the fact that we live on a rotating planet, so we're subject to seasons and to weather and to the passing of time, all of which also has a profound effect on everything I've just spoken about. So you can really think of the food system in this way. I'm an architect, so I tend to think spatially, that the plate of food in front of you goes out to the universe in terms of its implications. And in fact, my book, Sitopia, follows these different stages of scales of food, looking at the question, which I believe is the question we're ultimately asking, of what is a good life? Because that is the question you're asking when you're asking, how should we eat? Now, probably the best, the most beautiful vision of a good Sitopia, so a place where food is valued, is this one. It's the wonderful fresco of Ambrogio Lorenzetti, some of you may know, in the town hall in Siena. And it just shows city and country in perfect balance, really sort of the ideal relationship where there's a lot of trade going on, there's food coming into the city, pigs walking to market, a flock of sheep inside the city. And this perfect balance between a beautifully maintained city on the one hand and a beautifully maintained landscape on the other. And I think it's really interesting that the fathers of Siena had this up in their town hall. It was a kind of, for them, as the title of the piece says, the allegory of the effects of good government is that you maintain this relationship between the city and the countryside. Now, as we know today, we don't tend in any case to live in cities where you can just look out of the window and see the landscapes that are feeding you. They're usually very often around the other side of the world. They're very often very denatured landscapes, ones that you wouldn't necessarily want to paint and stick on your wall as a beautiful fresco. So we see this incredible distancing, both mentally but also physically, between city dwellers, which of course are now the majority of people on the planet, and the landscapes that feed them. And the paradox is that there's no ideal resolution to this, because we don't all live in tiny little cities like the Lorenzetti Siena, 13th century Siena anymore. Now, the first people to really address this problem were the ancient Greeks. This is Aristotle you're looking at here. And he had this term, he called humans political animals, which I find really interesting. Because on the one hand, because we're political, we belong in society. That's why we build cities. But on the other hand, we're animals. And so this also means nature. And actually, both Plato and Aristotle were extremely exercised by the question of how you found a balance between these two human needs. And they wondered about the ideal polis. So the polis was the city-state. That was the model of urbanity that the Greeks and indeed, the very first cities built were city-states. So they were blobs of urbanity surrounded by countryside. I call it the fried egg model of urbanity, where the yolk is the urban bit and the white is the countryside around it. And both Plato and Aristotle thought that the ideal city would remain small precisely because it would be able to maintain this balanced relationship between the city and the countryside. And they talked about economia, which just means household management. And basically the idea was that every citizen would have a house in the city and a farm in the countryside, and the farm would feed the house. And so household management, or economia, was basically maintaining at the level of a household this balance between the country and the city. And then if every citizen had that situation, then of course the city would be able to feed itself. And this would be ideal because then it would be politically independent and would not have to depend on another state for its sustenance. Now, some of you may have noticed that the word economia sounds a bit familiar. Of course, it forms the basis of our modern word economics, which I find extremely interesting because, of course, our modern economics bear extremely little relation to this principle. Most cities, in fact, adopted this model of remaining small and surrounding themselves with productive countryside. The very famous exception was Rome. I love talking about Rome because it really was the first city to thoroughly outgrow its local hinterland and to show the capacity of a metropolis to affect a landscape many hundreds of miles away from itself. And of course, Rome, at the height of its empire, was really sucking all the nutrients out of the entire Mediterranean Sea, even getting sort of honey from the Black Sea, oysters from London, but importing everything from oil and grain to pork and a liquamen fish sauce from all over the coast. So the capacity of a city and its appetite to really extend way beyond itself was demonstrated a very long time ago. And of course, today in the modern world, we're seeing this repeated where the powerful cities extend their demands and their reach over the entire globe. Now, of course, markets have always played an incredibly important part in the lives of cities. I've just put up this is a slightly kind of Eurocentric selection I have here, but I happen to know more about the history of these markets. And I can tell you that in all cases, the markets played an incredibly important part in the political life of the city, which I find extremely interesting. So again, Stéphane touched on this briefly, but the markets were not only the places in the city where people came to buy food, they were also places where people came to exchange news, to protest, to debate things. And so markets had this really powerful role, not just at the center of the city's food system, but also at the center of its social and political life. And I would say that sort of incredible power of markets began to be eroded with the arrival of railways in the early 19th century. Now, I mean, the effect of the railways was to basically, I call this slide goodbye geography. It was to destroy the ancient relationship between the city and the countryside, because for the first time it made it easy to transport food over long distances cheaply. And of course, this changes the fundamental relationship. Only cities like Rome in the pre-industrial world could grow to the size that they did because they had access to the sea. So water transport was what made it possible to bring food long distances, whereas now you could do it over land as well. So this very rapidly starts to transform the landscape, very crucially in areas of the New World. First of all, the New World in America, the American Midwest, gets basically within 10 years gets transformed from a grassland inhabited by Native Americans and tens of millions of bison. Bison are all shot with machine guns off the backs of the trains. The Native Americans are removed to reservations, and the world's first really vast monocultural grain fields are produced because it's possible to transport them easily into the city. And of course, what did the city do with this enormous bounty of grain? But they start feeding the grain to animals. So we have the creation of cheap industrial meat for the first time. But actually, Chicago is still quite a long way from the East Coast, where all the main markets were. So the really interesting thing is that the meat packers, like Swift and Company in Chicago, not only had to sort of invent this way of processing animals extremely efficiently, but also getting them to the East Coast where the markets were. And they actually built their own railway track to do this. The Swiss refrigerator line, which was supplied along the way. It was re-iced, so this is blocks of ice being dropped into the railway cars, and it's really the beginning of the chill chain. And then when they got to New York and cities like that, they actually set up these special advertising booths, and they undercut local butchers, trying to persuade people, yes, this meat comes from a long way away, and you may not trust it, but it's really cheap. So this is the first time we really see the sort of, if you like, the evolution of the modern food system, which is about vertical control, efficiencies of scale, the ability to undercut and so on. Now, of course, after the railways, we get the cars, and then we have the rise of the supermarkets, which is, if you like, the next level of this evolution towards bodies where instead of bringing the food into the center of the city, you basically build a big box outside the city and people drive out to it. And then, of course, this makes food logistics much easier because you just, for the food companies at least, you don't have to come into the city at all. You make people come out to the food. Of course, the food itself has to become denatured in order to withstand these new logistics. So it really is now profoundly starting to alter the relationship between people and food, because it's no longer fresh. They've no longer spoken to a human being when they've bought it and so on. So it's really the beginning of our modern disassociation from food itself. Of course, there's an illusion of cheap food, and as I don't have to tell any of you, that doesn't actually exist. Stéphane was questioning this figure. It varies what you include and what you don't include, but I've read quite a few studies that actually do attribute 30% of global greenhouse gas emissions to food, the food system and agriculture together. But in any case, it has a major impact. Of course, we have degraded soils globally, a freshwater crisis, diet-related disease, a huge amount of food waste, a lot of grain being fed to animals, so this is an extremely inefficient way of feeding ourselves, a huge amount of energy being consumed, a decline in insect and bird life, which is now causing a sixth mass extinction, and of course, last but not least, zoonotic pandemics, which are coming on the back of the loss of biodiversity in our system. So I think, what this slide summarizes is the fact that there is no such thing as cheap food, but the problem is that we've built societies, modern societies, on the assumption that there is, and it's a catastrophe, because it's turning the planet into a sort of denatured, depleted environment that is no longer capable of supporting us, and eating this way is also making us sick. So we have to ask what we're going to do about it. Again, Stéphane's talk was really addressing this problem directly. What I find interesting is that it's not a new question. In fact, for as long as people have been living in cities, they've been asking it. And in fact, the reason I invented this word Sitopia is because I realized that many utopians talk endlessly about food. And they all tend to come to the same conclusion, which is that the city and the countryside have to somehow get a closer relationship. So Plato, Thomas More writing the 16th century, Ebenezer Howard with his Garden City, they're all trying to say, how can we maximize the interface between the city and the country? And it happens that these three writers come up with the conclusion that the best way is to keep the city small. I think it's very important to say, as I said at the beginning, that, whenever we're trying to compare ways of feeding people, that's not primarily what we're doing. What we're primarily doing is saying which way of eating is going to give us a good life. So we have to turn the question on its head. So would you rather see cows eating grass, which they evolved to do, or would you rather see them getting sick, being pumped full of antibiotics in a concentrated animal feeding operation? Would you like to see people going to the middle of the city and meeting other humans when they buy food, or leaving the city in the name of efficiency, or even dialing it up on their phones? Do we imagine that a good life is one in which people share food around a table and talk and converse, or are we too busy to eat? And before lockdown, one of my favorite statistics was that 1 in 5 meals in America was being eaten in a car. So to me, this is a very upside down set of values we've created. I think we've forgotten what really makes us happy. And I think that's one of the things that COVID has been so interesting in highlighting, as I said. So, I mean, there's so much to say about COVID. And obviously in my 15 plus, I think I was allowed 20 minutes and I am going very fast. And but anyway, just to say this, I'm just skirting over the edge of many, many enormous issues. But of course, we saw, for instance, in India, under lockdown, 47 million people who were working in the city, their real home was in the countryside. They had no stability in the city. So we saw this mass migration. Hundreds of people died, in fact, in that migration back home. We're seeing city centres losing their vibrancy, many shops closing down. So there's a question of what city centres are going to be for in future. Of course, everyone's now working from home, or not everyone, in fact, but people who can afford to. But is that an ideal way of working? And of course, we're seeing massive unemployment because the economy has collapsed in some areas. So the question is, actually, what are we all going to do in future? And in food, it's been so interesting as well. I mean, Stéphane really dealt with the kind of the logistical end of it. I mean, really from a sort of consumer's point of view, we've seen some very interesting trends in Europe. Lots more cooking from home, obviously. And actually in the UK, people have said, there's been surveys where, nearly half of people have said they value food more as a result of lockdown, which is really interesting. We've seen local pubs turning themselves into food hubs to feed people because basically, partly because the supermarkets had the big crisis at the beginning with empty shelves, but also people haven't wanted to go to travel to buy their food. So we've seen a big increase in local food networks, big increase, of course, in people who can afford to staying at home and dialing up their food. And this is a load of delivery type drivers in Bangkok, actually, sort of socially distanced. And another trend that I find fascinating and actually rather disturbing in the UK is that there's been a sort of vast upsurge of people wanting to eat takeaway like McDonald's. And this is a sort of queue around the block of cars trying to go and get their hamburger to take home to eat, which is, to me, slightly mad. But anyway, it's happening. So the question, of course, is what is the role of markets going to be in all of this? And I'm totally with Stéphane on this. I think wholesale markets could have an absolutely crucial role to play in rethinking this question of how we're going to live well in the future. I've got this picture of Wakulima up here because I went there a few years ago and was blown away by it. Unfortunately, I know it's now being closed down, and I think this is incredibly short-sighted. I think we need to fight for our markets to continue to exist in the middle of cities, and not only just to do what they already do, but to reinvent the food system again, as Stéphane was saying. For me, the critical thing that wholesale markets can do is they can rejoin. So I've just shown the Agora there as a sort of the greatest exemplar of a market that I know. But what markets have always done is they've brought society and nature together. So in a way, they have been the place where the urban paradox I spoke about before gets resolved. And actually, if you look at this image of the Agora, it's quite accurate. It was a very natural space, interestingly, in the middle of Athens. There were trees. It was bucolic. So people came there to vote and to talk, but they were also, and buy food, obviously, but they were also in the midst of nature in the city. So it's that remembering that, living in a city is an artificial thing. And without the countryside, it can't exist. I think markets have an amazing role to play. Again, Stéphane mentioned this in reminding people of the true value of food, because fresh food, grown with love, grown without destroying landscapes, grown with a short supply chain is the best food. And it's ironic that it's usually during a crisis like the Second World War or the fall of the Soviet Union or the collapse of the car industry in Detroit that people remember the true value of food, because you've got to eat, basically. And of course, the same thing's happening under COVID. So there is no such thing as cheap food, as I said earlier. I think wholesale markets have an amazing role to play in democratizing food. So This is what the European food system looks like at the moment. It's a tree with lots of farmers and lots of consumers controlled by very few supermarket buying desks. And I think what we need is to join the consumers to the producers much more directly. So wholesale markets exist in this space between the producers and the consumers, actually providing an alternative supply chain to the supermarkets. I think, food animates society. We tend to forget this, and it's right the way through the food chain. So it's, how do we produce the food? How do we buy and sell it? How do we eat it, whether we're eating it outside, in the city, or in our own homes? It's all about social connection. It's all about a good life and how we can do all of these things, both nurturing ourselves and the planet. And of course, it's about how we actually produce the food and how we do it in relation to nature. And I think, as I said earlier, industrialized food has actually been the cause of, the greatest destruction that mankind has wrought on our planet in the last century. And we have to return to more integrated ways of working with nature. And the beautiful thing is that we can feed the world, quote unquote, this way. And there are many incredible models, both ancient ones, by the way. So China, I know we have many Chinese representatives here. China was the original innovator of permaculture. And there's a 5,000-year-long tradition of farming that way in China. So we're rediscovering old wisdom. Of course, we have to bring these together in the places that we live. So this could be through local farms. This is one I visited in Kenya, outside Nairobi. We have to incorporate food in city governance. We have to think about the latent productivity of the food sheds of city regions and see how we can reconnect that landscape to the city itself. That's a study that was done in New York of the potential of the New York region to feed the city. Of course, we need infrastructure like abattoirs, local abattoirs, if that's going to be possible. And of course, the wholesale markets are the nexus through which smaller scale independent shops can be supplied. And everybody loves these sorts of spaces. So we need to value them and plan for them. So this is a government thing. This is where I'm coming back to Florence. This is the allegory of the effects of good government. You don't get here just by leaving it to the market. We need vision to create this. And of course, good jobs. So this question of what is everybody going to do all day, they can feed us if we value food. So all of these are examples of a good Sitopia, what I would call a good Sitopia. And if we go out to the bigger scale again, of course, it is about that relationship between the city and nature, the city and the countryside that I talked about. And again, across the world, there are really interesting models of how those two things can be brought together. Bringing food into the city, growing food in the city, the relationship between local suburban farms and cities, and even imagining city regions in which food growing is incorporated. And I call these landscapes of human and non-human flourishing, because I think the big challenge that we face now is learning how to coexist with nature and with one another. So Stéphane talked about inequality and accessibility to food. That's obviously a huge part of this. I believe food is the most obvious way by valuing it and then making it accessible to people, which means, by the way, different taxation systems and minimum wages and so on, so that we even up society. But a good society is one in which everyone eats well. That is my definition. And I think wholesale markets have a crucial leadership role to play in creating that. And if you want to know more about Sitopia, that's my book. Thank you very much.
Thank you a lot, Carolyn, for this presentation. It's always an honor to have you with us. We had her already for our independent dialogue for Europe, and I think it's really important to have a broader image of where we're coming from and to walk not looking at our feet, but looking at 360 degrees, so in front, behind, and our sides, and also to the skies, in order to be able to approach this food transition in a really systemic and long-term way. So we're going to have now the president of Chinese Wholesale Market Association is our honorary chairman, and he used to be our chairman before Mr. Layani took his position, Mr. Ma Zengjun.
Hello, 大家好。非常高兴我能够在线上参加视频联的会，因为疫情的原因呢，我们去年的会也没有召开。那么今年呢，实际上是疫情呢还没有完全解除，所以我们这次视频联的会呢，就采取了线上和。
Good morning. I'm very glad to be here today. Unfortunately, last year I could not take part in the conference, but this year, hopefully, I am glad to be here. The COVID-19 pandemic has brought about many changes in our sector and in the way we meet. Today, for instance, we are attending this meeting, and some of us are attending it in person, some of us are attending it online. The pandemic has affected considerably the flows of people and the flows of goods as well. During the pandemic, I used to buy especially online because I could not go to supermarkets or anywhere. Many people therefore got used to buying their products online, and therefore wholesale markets could really go through a major growth also through the pandemic with the help of online media. Before the pandemic, e-commerce was still quite far from our everyday habits, especially in our sector, but the pandemic really accelerated our business growth, and this has also had an impact on the logistics and on the supply chain overall in order to reach the households of our consumers directly with our products. And therefore, we have undertaken an analysis, a review, in order to try and understand how we can tap and draw the most benefit from the e-commerce as a whole. Today, I also would like to share one thought with you. We have had a problem with infection from coronavirus through food submitted to the products that are in general frozen, and therefore we now have 3 certifications that are mandatory in China in order to sell frozen products. Once we detected coronavirus in salmon or in shrimps, for instance, we were forced for some time not to sell these products. Then we developed tests, nucleic acid tests, that are now performed right at the customs when frozen products are imported. We then perform the same tests also at later stages up to the sale of the product. And in this framework, we have improved our quality control procedures applied to cold chain food. we apply this to fish products very much and less frequently to meat. However, since fruit and vegetables are perishable, and considering that customs clearance operations have been slowing down gradually over the recent times, we have improved our procedures to perform these tests. Another improvement we have witnessed is that new contingency plans were developed in this field. We have experienced what lockdowns mean, and therefore our major, in China, everywhere in our provinces and main cities, we have developed contingency plans in order to make it possible to ensure ongoing delivery and supply and stable prices. After the pandemic, the wholesale markets have undergone these three major changes. However, there is still room to implement better solutions, improved solutions targeted to our consumers. Quite recently in India, Malaysia, or in Southern Asian countries, we are witnessing a resurgence in the pandemic, and therefore we are now trying to understand how we can cope with these emergencies while guaranteeing a food supply. We have acquired a good experience over the recent time, and we will, of course, follow the lessons this has taught us. In 2019, when we held our conference in China, in Qian, I had already proposed to the Union to set up a working group focusing on e-commerce in order to develop a platform that may help us in our online sales. So I know that work is going on in this respect, and I think that it is quite important for us to develop this platform. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Ma, for your intervention. We're really sad that you couldn't be with us in this conference, and we remember with a lot of joy the conference in China that took place right before the COVID outbreak. So we're going to hear now Lawrence Haddad. He's the director of GAIN, the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, that is making us the honor to be with us today. Thank you very much, and I'm giving the floor to Lawrence.
Thank you so much, colleagues. It's my pleasure to be here and to talk to you. And I'd like to thank Mr. Layani and wholesale market colleagues for inviting me to do this. So I'm going to be quite brief, at about 10 minutes, I hope, and quite practical. The first thing I want to do is talk about how food consumption patterns have changed because of COVID. Second thing I want to do is talk about how the things we've appreciated about the food system because of the COVID stress test. And finally, I want to stress that this crisis that we're in is a threat, but also an opportunity. So first on how food consumption patterns have actually changed. There are sort of two things that have happened. One is that people are consuming less food and people are consuming worse food. So people are consuming less food. That's not really surprising. The lockdowns have resulted, and the infections and mortality have resulted in a massive economic shock. And if you look at the IMF projections for GDP per capita growth in 2021 and 2022, while the advanced economies are projected to bounce back quite quickly in 21 and 22, the emerging economies are not projected to bounce back. And in fact, they are projected to get even slightly worse than they are right now. So that's not so surprising. We've seen food prices increase. The FAO, UN Food and Agriculture Organization, published some numbers earlier this month that showed that world food prices have increased by 39% in the last 12 months. And I'm fully expecting world hunger numbers to increase from 690 million by tens of millions in the next report we get from the UN, which is very soon this month. And there have been, another reason why consumption has fallen is that there are some key social assistance programs that stopped working. In the first 9 months of the lockdown, the last 3 quarters of 2020, UNICEF data showed that a majority of the countries they track school feeding programs just stopped because schools were closed, and there was no provision for maintaining the school lunch program outside of school attendance. So it's not surprising that less food is being consumed, but it does have very severe consequences for hunger numbers and for mortality numbers. But in addition to less food being consumed, worse food is being consumed. This is because when food systems are disrupted, it's the perishable foods that suffer the most in terms of food loss, food waste, and their prices fluctuate the most, and they're most volatile. And the most perishable foods tend to be the ones that are the most nutrient dense: the fruits, vegetables, eggs, dairy, fish, these kinds of foods. So we've seen their prices go up and down, and that the prices of the most nourishing, most nutrient-rich foods are the ones that are rising most sharply. We've also seen an increase in the consumption of foods that are high in convenience. People can't get out as much, they can't move around as much. There's a lot more convenience food being purchased, I would say especially in the high and middle income context, but also in the lower income contexts. And convenience food tends to be high in things like salts, sugar, added sugar, and trans fats, and other kinds of saturated fats. There's also been I think Carolyn mentioned this, there's also been an understandable increase in the consumption of comfort foods, foods that are going to make us feel good without necessarily being good for us. And then finally, a lot of fresh food markets were just shut down in the 6 months and continue to be operating in restricted modes because food safety protocols, COVID protocols were not put in place. We already know that, as Mr. Layani mentioned, 3 billion people can't afford a healthy diet, and that was pre-COVID. And I imagine that number has increased quite substantially because of the COVID infection and lockdowns. So that's the first thing. There's less food being consumed and worse food. Second thing, I think the stress test of COVID-19 and the associated lockdowns really made us appreciate a number of things. I think first of all, they made us appreciate the cost of a healthy diet, how difficult it is to get access to food, both in terms of availability, but also in terms of affordability. And fortunately, social protection programs, primarily cash transfer programs, scaled up dramatically in the first 6 months after COVID struck. The numbers of people engaged in social protection programs increased from 0.6 billion to about 1.3 billion. And that's going to help address the income deficits and the income challenges for people to buy healthier diets. I think the other thing, the second appreciation, was around the role of food system workers. Many of us began to appreciate even more the role of health system workers being on the front lines and having to deal with high infection rates and high hospitalization rates. But equally, a number of us really appreciated the role of the food system workers, because when they get sick, and remember that many of them, especially at the retail end of things, are really vulnerable and exposed to higher rates of infection. When they get sick, the whole food system just grinds to a halt. And so we've seen a greater emphasis and a greater appreciation on things like workforce nutrition programs that keep workers in the food system. And remember, there are at least 1 billion workers in the food system, keeping those workers better nourished, better fed, with better nutrition information. Because remember, good nutrition is a way of preventing lots of comorbidities that are important for COVID severity rates. We've also seen an appreciation of the role of cold chains. Cold chains are vital for healthier diets and more perishable foods, which are high in nutrients. Cold chains are also vital for vaccines. And there's, in my work with the UN Food System Summit, there's some really interesting solutions emerging from places like the Cool Coalition that are looking at reusable cold boxes that can be used for vaccines, but can also be used for perishable foods. They can be aggregated at the community level so they can be used by smallholder farmers. Really interesting sets of solutions. There's also been an appreciation of the role of non-communicable diseases, especially diet-related diseases. So I live in the UK, and the UK's Prime Minister contracted COVID-19. It was, by all accounts, a pretty severe case of COVID-19. And he himself said it's because he was overweight. And interestingly, this has resulted in, it's given a bit of a boost to some of the UK's own policy, legislation and regulation around junk food advertising and things like that, things that are really important to improve the food environment, especially for young people. We've also seen an appreciation of the role of small and medium enterprises in the food system. Most consumers and citizens in low and middle income contexts, especially in Africa and South Asia, but also in Southeast Asia, they no matter how poor they are, they buy the bulk of their food. They purchase the bulk of their food. And if they purchase the bulk of their food, they're usually purchasing from small and medium enterprises. These small and medium enterprises don't have the capacity to withstand big shocks. They don't have